I don't care about Gaza. This is a territory that's 1/10 the size of Rhode Island. It produces nothing, it consumes nothing, it transits nothing. Budget is aid that is dispensed by the UN in Israel. It is a non-factor in most international relations. If you're in Israel, very different story, but I'm usually looking at the big picture. This is going to sound horrible, but I've been a little annoyed at how much bandwidth this has taken from everybody for something that in the end of the day really doesn't matter very much. We know from intercepts and intel that's come out since that while the Iranians may certainly have nudged this to happen because they were trying to disrupt some negotiations between Israel and Saudi Arabia on normalization, this was a homegrown plot with locally trained people picking up on the tactics that ISIS used to use. It should have been detected months ahead of time. In fact, it looks like now there were some very explicit warnings coming from folks in the IDF and Mossad and Shin Bet going back up to a year. The problem on the Israeli side is governance. There are people who got their positions because the religious parties got their rabbis to tell their congregations to vote for these folks. None of them have any real world experience, and they pretend that they own the defense establishment because they beat their chest a lot. But in reality, they've degraded the military and the intelligence services at every turn and ignored all the warnings that weren't politically convenient for them. And because of that, this happened, and that's horrible. And for Israel, there's some soul searching that has to go down here. But first things first, they have to prevent it from ever happening again. And that means the Gaza war and all the ugliness that's coming from that. The growth industry is the consulting business around the Pentagon in times of peace, because then there's always a billion things you can get ready for as opposed to one very specific thing that you have to fight. Iran publicly thinks of Hamas as apostates worthy of execution. The Iranians are Persian and Shia, and the
Yeah.
Palestinians are Sunni and Arab. They are not friends. They are allies of convenience at most. And so if Iran had been in charge of things, they still would have had no problem burning them to get the outcome that they have right now. I would say the
Because they certainly
IRGC and the
help them.
mullahs hate almost everyone because there's no one out there who's Persian and Shia. So there's a hierarchy.
Yeah.
Hezbollah may be Arab, but they're also Shia. So, they are a proxy. They are a tool. Hamas is at best something that they've thrown a few resources at as kind of a long haul bet just to see what happens, and it's paid off.
I
I
see
think
that
all
playing
three of
out.
them have something different that they're going for. Of the three, Iran has the longest legs and is going to be with us well throughout this century and into the next. They would love a world in which the Middle East was rearranged to recognize the fact that they are the superior demographic and military force of the Persian Gulf. The problem with that is that all of the Arabs are bit by bit getting in bed with the Jews of Israel into a broad spectrum intelligence and strategic alliance. And if you get Saudi Arabia to join the UAE and Morocco and Egypt and Jordan, who are already in there, then you've pretty much got a lock on the future of the region, and they've got to do everything they can to break that. The problem they're going to come up with is that the United States just doesn't care as much about the oil anymore. And so threatening, say, the Strait of Hormuz doesn't generate the panic in Washington that it used to. So they've got to look for other tools. And in this case, Hamas was a tool to that end.
Mm.
So from their point of view, they've got a bad hand. They're playing it reasonably well. This is not something that the United States is capable of fighting anymore. It used to be that we had a 500 ship navy with a lot of small vessels that could have long reach and patrol. And now we've got 12 supercarrier battle groups. We
Yeah.
don't have enough small vessels to even theoretically patrol a third of the world's oceans, much less all of them. Seeing the United States struggle with this mismatch of resources to taskings when it's just the Houthis, it's a serious taste of things to come. Yeah, see, the problem is there's only two that matter. The Brits and the Japanese, they're the only ones with long reach navies. There are other allies that we have that do have navies, but they can't operate outside of their own region. But we have transoceanic trade involving over 10,000 container ships and 5,000 ships of other types, all sailing every day. So you're talking about billions of container ship miles every year, and only 3 ships can
Hmm.
patrol out of region.
Multitude of
When I
issues.
talk to DoD, I basically make two broad recommendations. Number one is you have got to get clear guidance from the White House. We have not had what I would consider a real strategic decision between the Joint Chiefs and the presidency since Herbert Walker Bush. And so they're working on guidance that's 35 years old at this point, based on a military structure and a global structure that have long since disappeared. The second, don't sell yourself short and spend 1% of your time thinking about what happens the day after you win. Because we didn't do that for the Soviet Union, and we are still cleaning up that mess. I would like
Mhm.
us to have some proactive conversations about what a post-China Asia looks like. Let's say that we wanted to go back to the 1980s vessel count and type. If we start today, we'll have that in 30 years. It's just that's the time
Yeah.
turnaround for building vessels of size. So now, if you would have asked that question of, say, the Belgians or the Germans or the French back during the Iraq War in 2003 to 2009, you would have gotten an answer. It would have been a stupid answer. But they were thinking about it then in a different context, because that was back when the Russians and the French and the Germans were doing all those joint press conferences about how the United States is done in Europe. We need to make it a new strategic architecture and blah, 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 blah. Now that we've actually had a real fight, the Europeans, almost to every individual country, have come to the conclusion that there is no security for Europe that doesn't involve the United States. Now, they're all taking that lesson to heart in different ways. But even the French are now talking openly about how the bilateral relationship between Paris and Washington is the bedrock of European defense. And while they do want more European strength in decision making, there's no agreement on what that looks like. But there is agreement that working with the United States is just simpler, faster, and more effective. Well, I'd
Can
argue
you
that
add?
the numbers and the politics are moving in the right direction. Every European country is in the process of expanding their military, some, like the Swedes and the Poles, by just mammoth volumes. Even Spain, dangling way out on the edge, who has nothing to fear from the Russians, is getting in on the act. Now, we can all argue that it's too slow and it's too late and all that, and that's fine. But things are moving in the right direction. There's also an understanding in Europe that it all begins with ammo. And if they can't keep the stream of ammo to Ukraine functional, then none of the rest of this is even worth talking about. And they've discovered the United States can't expand its ammo production any faster than it is. So we're actually seeing first line industrial build out across Europe for that. Now, again, too little, too late, too slow. We can all argue about that, but they are moving in the right direction. And for the last 9 months, they've given more military aid to the Ukrainians than we have. So Germany was the first country to urbanize at scale with when they went through their own industrial revolution around the turn of the previous century, so 1900. And so were the first country to have the majority of their population living in cities. And when you live in a city, you generally have fewer kids because they're more of an expense. They're not helping you on the farm. They're not free labor. Then we had World War II, which obviously dented their demographics a bit. And in the aftermath of World War II, all of a sudden they had access to the globalized world. It was like they had won World War II and World War I and every other war they'd ever fought by an order of magnitude and access to everything. And they were able to take their German acumen and focus it entirely on economics. In fact, we told them they had to. We told them they couldn't have a military that was independent. So 70 years of that, they just stopped having kids.